Salama. Kama nilivyotambulishwa, naitwa Ayub Rioba, Chacha, kutoka Shirika la Utangazaji Tanzania. Asante sana Taji Liundi, asante sana Ana Mwasioke. Lakini niwashukuru sana pia waandaaji wa shughuli hii ambayo ni muhimu na imefana sana. Na bila kupoteza wakati basi nianze. Kwanza nitazungumza kwa Kiswahili kidogo, alafu baadaye nitazungumza kwa ile lugha iliyokuja na meli. Niseme tu kwamba karibuni sana Arusha, hasa wageni ambao mmekuja kutoka nje ya Tanzania. Lakini niwakumbushe tu kwamba Tanzania ndio nyumbani kwa binadamu wote. Yaani kwa inavyojulikana, binadamu wa kwanza duniani aliishi hapa Ngorongoro. Kwa wale kesho mtakao kwenda Ngorongoro, mtaonyeshwa kuna eneo fulani ambapo binadamu wetu wa kwanza aliishi. Kwa hiyo wote mnaokuja hapa maana yake mnakuwa mmekuja nyumbani. Na huwa ninashangaa na nitajaribu kuongea na serikali ni kwa nini watu wahitaji visa wanapokuwa wanarudi nyumbani. Ili wakati mwingine mnapokuwa mnakuja mje tu kwa sababu hapa ni kwenu. Kwa na sio wa Afrika tu, lakini watu wote mpaka wale wenzetu. Na Tanzania ni nchi nzuri sana. Na nilikuwa niwasilishe kwa kuonyesha Tanzania ilivyo, lakini hatutatumia ile inayoitwa PowerPoint. Yaani nguvu kituo. Tutazungumza tu hivi hivi. Na vivutio vingi ambavyo nchi inavyo, wakati mwingine unajiuliza kwamba hivi Mungu aliipendelea Tanzania? Ndio maana tumemshukuru sana rais wetu kwa kazi kubwa aliyofanya kwenye hii Royal Tour. Hakuna maelezo ya kutosha kuelezea umuhimu na faida za rais wetu Mheshimiwa Samia Suluhu Hassan kushiriki katika uandaaji wa hii filamu au wengine wanaita makala maalum ambayo inaitwa Royal Tour, ambayo imezungumzia uzuri wa Tanzania ambapo ni nyumbani kwa binadamu wote. Na kwa kufanya hivyo, Mheshimiwa Rais amewakaribisha tena wanadamu wote waliopo duniani, kokote kule duniani, watakaoiona hiyo filamu, kuwakumbusha kwamba huku mlikokimbia miaka ile ni kuzuri kiasi hiki. Kwa hiyo tunaamini tutawapata wengi sana ambao wangependa kuja kuona nyumbani na kuona mazuri ya nyumbani. Na kwa hakika nimalizie kumshukuru sana Mheshimiwa Rais kwa sababu kwenye uongozi wake tumeona jinsi ambavyo kazi anayoifanya, kwa mfano hii tu ya kuwaambia wanadamu wengine huko ulimwenguni kwamba waje Tanzania, maana yake ni kwamba wakija uchumi wetu utakuwa bora, mbali na wao kutembelea kama watalii, lakini pia kutakuwa na mahusiano ya kibiashara na yatasababisha kazi kuongezeka, ajira kuongezeka, yataboresha maisha ya watu. Lakini kama mlivyoona pia katika uongozi wake, Mheshimiwa Rais amehakikisha anajikita sana kuboresha maisha ya kila siku ya Watanzania, iwe ni kwenye afya, iwe kwenye maji, iwe ni kwenye elimu na kadhalika na kadhalika. Na hilo ni jambo zuri sana kwamba hata wanaporudi wale ndugu zetu waliokimbilia nje wanatukuta na sisi hali zetu ni bora zaidi. Sasa niendelee na wasilisho langu. Nitajitahidi kuongea kwa ufupi sana kwa sababu unajua watu wakikutakia, kama hawakutakii mema, wanakuweka muda ambao watu wote wanayemsubiri wala sio wananisikiliza mimi, wanakuwa wanamsubiri. Kwa hiyo hapa nipo tu, wananitizama watu, nitadhani wananitizama mie, kumbe I had wanted to start with history, media history, a brief history of media, just to show that even before the coming of aliens here in Africa, we had our own mediated communication as encapsulated by Uboja. Uboja is a scholar from West Africa who posits that we had our own forms of communication, various forms of communication. I don't have time to mention all of them, but he terms them as orality, meaning oral. And the media at the time, mediated communication, the media that were there were regulated through community-based norms. And I'm saying this because we are here on a World Press Freedom Day. And by the way, before I proceed, Eid Mbaraka. So, and then came colonial media. Here in Africa, you can trace them in different parts of the continent. In Tanzania, so to speak, the earliest or the first newsletter was called Msimulizi, or Newsbearer, and it was based in Zanzibar, 1888. And at that time, the regulatory framework was to make sure that the media, the colonial media, helped to civilize the natives. The natives were uncivilized, uncouth, so you were to be civilized. But at the same time, the media also helped the colonial government to run the government smoothly. And later we had freedom fighters who established newspapers. Here in Tanzania, for example, of course you go to Nigeria, you go to many other countries in Africa where freedom fighters, or those who agitated for independence, established newspapers to help them, build a case for, or make a case for independence. And then post-colonial period, the media had a mission to build their nations, because when the colonialists left, they did not leave nations. So the media had to make sure they help in the duty of building the nation, building national unity, cultural reawakening, mobilization of citizens for development. But the regulation, or the regulatory framework at the time, remained mainly that which was in place since colonial times. Maybe I will explain later. And that's why during the second multi-party paradigm in the 90s, regulation was supposed to free the media from draconian colonial laws so that the media may play the role of the fourth estate. My presentation was supposed to have some pictures. Now, in 1991, when African journalists, about 68 of them from 33 countries on the continent, when they met in Windhoek, Namibia, what brought them there? UNESCO was there, of course. UNESCO is the one which convened the meeting. Why were they? Why were they? Why did they go there? They went to Windhoek to discuss the political situation, political and economic situation. You remember post-independence Africa was riddled by problems, corruption, military coups, famine, wars, etc., etc. I mean, if you talk about these simplistically, you will think it's because Africans were stupid, they couldn't govern themselves, and that's why they had all these problems. But when you scrutinize further, you learn that there were other complex factors that caused all these problems that Africa was facing. But there was a thinking. One of the casualties of those regimes of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, one of the casualties was actually media. So the media met to see how do we, first of all, create an environment for our own survival, and secondly, how do we help our countries out of these problems that our countries are facing? And there were enormous problems. Various scholars, for those of you who care to read, have written extensively about Africa. And there are different ways in which they write about Africa, depending on where they come from, and depending on the kind of spectacles they use to look at Africa.
Ndugu zangu, alimradi unamuona mtu Mheshimiwa Dr. amesimama hapa juu na toa wasilisho lake, na wewe kaa kimya. Usizungumze kabisa na mwenzako. Vinginevyo toka nje. Kikao hapa kimeanza, sasa ni rasmi. Shughuli hii ni ya Mheshimiwa Rais. Kwa namna hiyo basi, ndio naelewa, nitafunga milango. Kwa namna hiyo basi, kama upo humo ndani, upo ndani sasa ya tukio rasmi. Naomba tuwe na heshima na ukumbi huu na wasilisho hili la kwanza la msingi na muhimu sana. Asanteni. Dr. endelea.
Asante. Mimi ni mwalimu lakini sikujua kwamba watu kumbe wanaongea wakati nawasilisha. Nikajua kwamba nimesema vitu vizito kwa hiyo. Now, like I was saying, if you read about Africa, there's quite a lot of literature about Africa, and there are many scholars. I'll mention just a few. You have scholars like, have we heard of Charles Darwin? We know Charles Darwin. We have scholars like Martin Meredith. How many of you have read his books? He writes, one of the well-known books by him is The State of Africa. Martin Meredith, he's a British journalist. And then we have Matthew Paris. He's also a British journalist. He once wrote in the 90s that there were very hopeless countries on the continent, and if it was possible, Britain should just go back and recolonize them and teach them how to behave in a more civilized manner. There's Michelle Arong. How many of you have read Michelle Arong? She's also a British journalist. She's written, I've read a couple of her books. It's Our Turn to Eat. There's a book called I Did Not Do It For You, about Eritrea, and there's another book called In the Footsteps of Mr. Kudz, about the Congo. We have Ludo De Vite, who has written a book called The Assassination of Lumumba. There's Adam Hochschild, who has written a book, King Leopold's Ghost. We have Robert Kaplan, an American journalist, who wrote a book stating how in 50 years' time, from 1997, when he came to, on a tour of his book. I was in Europe at that time, and he said, in 50 years, Africa will blink into oblivion because of famine, wars, and other bad things. Poverty, diseases, wars, and what have you. And of course we have John Reader, who has written a book about how rich Africa is. That's where I came to know that it's probably the richest continent on earth. You have Keith Richburg. How many of you read him? An American journalist, a black American journalist who came here to report the war in Somalia, and then he went to Rwanda. He stayed here a couple of months, and then he flew out. And he wrote, I'll give you one line, which was very controversial. He said he thanks his parents, his ancestors. He thanks God his ancestors were taken out of Africa in chains, and therefore he's not one of us, we the Africans. He's an American. He had covered the war in Somalia and the war in Rwanda, and he had concluded that these are not human beings. He's a black American. And then we have Duncan Clark. He has written a book about Africa, a crude continent. If you read what happens with our oil and natural resources, you remember yesterday what our minister said, why is it that in Africa, everywhere where you have resources and then people suffer? It's like we have this resource curse. Of course, we have other authors like Chimamanda Ngozi. How many of you have read Chimamanda Ngozi? She has written non-fiction. She writes other books. And if you Google, you'll find her, where she talks also about the problem with a single story. And then we have Dr. Mumbi, Mumbi from Kenya. She's also a Pan-Africanist, and she's quite vocal about problems and issues relating to Africa. We have Dr. Arikana Chiombori. This is a sister originally from Zimbabwe. At one time, she was our permanent representative to the US. In case you haven't heard of her, just Google. Very interesting. Why am I saying all this? I'm saying all this because the authors I've mentioned here are talking about Africa. Africa faces challenges, some of which are probably of its own making, governance, if you will. But Africa also faces problems, some of which are perpetuated by people with vested interest in Africa, and that we have to note. So when journalists met in Windhoek in 1991, they wanted to address those issues, and they believed that if we have a conducive environment, if you have media freedom, the media will be capable to play a role to make the situation in Africa better. So that was a time when already some reforms were taking place in Africa, including allowing political parties, changing the political system, reforming laws, including media laws, enabling private media to register, and et cetera, et cetera. And the results after the reforms included the proliferation of private media outlets. Prior to that, we had very few official media, and now after the 90s, we saw more privately owned media established, newspapers, radio stations, TV stations. And we also started to see, relative freedom to report wrongs, to criticize government. If I give you an example, I did a study previously, a few years ago. In Tanzania, from the situation we were in, where the media were not that free, to a situation where a newspaper would carry a headline saying, Nyerere ni mtu wa kuchinjwa. And at that time, a father of the nation was still alive, and here was a headline, Nyerere deserves to be slaughtered. Not even hanged, slaughtered. Hanging has a bit of civility. Gentlemen, we are going to hang you. But slaughtering, it's like you are slaughtering a cow, so it's very undignified, undignifying. And we had also more effort. We had bad journalism, unethical practices. And then we had, of course, more effort to self-regulate. Kajubi is here. I did a study. My PhD was on the efficacy of self-regulation in the context of our democratization. So I know the role that self-regulation has actually played in Tanzania. Fewer incidents, of course, there are other countries where self-regulation has been tried. There were fewer incidents of casualties among journalists, and threat to media freedom began to come from other circles, because it had been known that only the government posed a threat to media in society, especially in Africa. And then we began to see that even the corporate world could actually pose threats. If I had time, I don't have enough time, I would have shared with you examples not only here in Tanzania, East Africa, and the rest of the region, about how non-governmental sector also has posed threats to media freedoms in Africa. And sometimes media became too liberal, often ignoring national interests. Someone will be deceiving you if they tell you that you, here in Africa, do not have national interests. Right now, for the first time, I normally follow the media, for example, in the US. You have Fox News here, CBS News, you have CNN, and it will be very clear that they don't agree. Always, they don't agree. They differ, and sometimes differences are so wide apart, you would think they belong to two different countries. But today, the reportage of the war between Russia and Ukraine, I can't tell where is Fox News, where is CNN, where is... No, they have converged. Why? National interests. And increasingly, local content began to be replaced by foreign content. And I'm not in any way saying we should not have foreign content. No, what I'm saying is, yes, but have it sparingly. I've been to countries outside Tanzania, in Asia, in Europe, in America, and in my hotel room, I would try to flip through channels to see what content they have. I'm telling you, I don't normally see myself. The only time I see myself is if there's a program about wildlife in Africa. Then at least I can relate to my cousins that I see on TV. But here, sometimes you will sit in a hotel room, you won't even find local channels. And when you find them, you won't find local content. So, in a way, also, in the political dispensation, private media became opposition, if you know what I mean. While state media, like the one I run, became the ruling party. Civil societies multiplied in numbers and objectives. Initially, private media, of course, faced some financial difficulties. You have so many newspapers, for example, chasing the same few adverts. The private sector is still in its nascent stage, still growing, so it doesn't have enough money to distribute to all the media outlets, so that way the media also suffered. Freedom of expression found a wider space, and more journalism colleges were established. And by the way, let me just share with you a few of what I consider to be success stories of the role that the media played. The media that had started to enjoy relative higher degree of freedom. Number one, the media conducted investigative journalism to expose corruption and other vices. I know there were casualties here in Africa. I could share with you some stories. But I think that changed the way things had been run before. That you expose corruption in big ways, and thereby enhancing accountability in society. We started to see that culture of impunity changing in Africa for the first time. And whoever knows, young people may not know where Africa is coming from. Today, what we see, the level of tolerance from the governments in Africa was not there. So, providing space for citizens to air their views and concerns, mobilizing citizens on issues of national importance, like it was mentioned even the first day we were here, how the media played a very important role during the COVID-19. The media is still playing an important role. By the way, COVID-19, is it still there? Has it gone? It has not even let us know. You know, just like that. So those who know, please, just in case, I will appreciate. And enabling political parties and civil societies to be heard, enhancing economic development, and the inclusivity. Exclusivity was a big problem in Africa in those years. Standing up for the poor, the marginalized, and the forgotten, standing up for justice, fairness, peace, unity, ensuring natural resources benefit the citizens. And I have tried to go through what other scholars discuss this democratization phase and the role of the media in that context. One of the key issues they touch on is technology. So I'm moving towards technology and then towards the conclusion of my presentation. We all know that the advent of ICTs and therefore the proliferation of social media or digital media platforms has actually changed the way society communicates. And we know that increasingly more and more people, I'm told in the US almost 50% of people get their news on digital media platforms. The speed of information today is quite unimaginable. I remember those of us who used P.O. Box. If you ask some young people around what is P.O. Box, they will look at you as if you are from Mars or you are related to dinosaurs. And so the speed today of information, an accident occurs or happens somewhere, and these people will be sharing, live that information to other people as the smoke still goes up, as people are being pulled out of the wreckage. And the power of gatekeepers, I've seen quite a number of them, and it was quite a pleasure to meet some of the people who inspired me when I was young as a journalist. The power of gatekeepers, which we all know how powerful editors were, has also been diminished considerably. And those, you remember those? Accuracy, objectivity, impartiality, fairness, comprehensiveness of news, are they still regarded in so-called citizen journalism? Audiences are no longer bystanders waiting to be fed the news. They too participate. They create news, they gather news, they create content, they distribute news, they discuss and analyze news. They have ample opportunities they did not have before. And those who did not have a voice in society in the past, today they have a voice. Some talents never even seen in traditional media before have emerged from the crowd of novices who utilize opportunities in digital media in ways never imagined before. Governments and corporate entities, as powerful as they can be, are no longer in total control of what is exposed on social media about them. Individuals with a drive to succeed are taking to digital media to do business, gain knowledge and skills that have turned their lives around. Individuals with no capital have established blogs and online platforms, attracting more audiences than traditional media. I was talking to my young brother, Max, and he was explaining to me the transformation that is taking place within Jamii Forum. And for Africa and its global cousins, internet-based platforms have come to address the imbalanced flow of information. For those of you who remember the debate that raged for years and championed by UNESCO about the imbalanced flow of information. Now, the dark side of digital media, opportunities for free expression and information sharing through digital media have also exposed the dark side of freedom. Cultural and community values are murdered on a broad daylight, while perversive values from globalization take over as the new normal. National unity is facing an existential threat from opinions, views, and ideas churned out of malicious individuals and groups. National security is equally facing a threat from those who wish to face off with their governments. Individuals or groups with an axe to grind are freely and recklessly using digital media to settle scores with their perceived enemies. Character assassination and expressions aimed at murdering the dignity of individuals and entities are increasingly becoming normal. Terrorist groups are using digital media platforms to learn about devastating ways to kill their enemies and are also teaching others to do the same. Fake news, remember President Trump? Fake news is a new phenomenon, but of course it's an extension of old habits, old traditions. It has come to discredit digital media quite a lot. In the past, of course, the problem used to be lack of information. We didn't have sufficient information, so people resorted to rumors because we didn't have enough information. Ndimara Tigambwage, whom I mentioned here on the first day, he wrote a book. He actually gathered rumors in a particular period of time, there were about 800 and something rumors that were circulating around Tanzania at that time. Why were there rumors? Because we didn't have these opportunities that we have today where people can share information. Now, while we had a problem of too little information in the public realm, today the problem is too much information, to the extent that information is becoming problematic by itself, or confusing to audiences. But we shouldn't forget, digital media are also controlled by the powerful. You remember Trump's Twitter account was taken out? And sometimes I tend to ask myself, is this internet going to be as free as it appears now, or will it also soon be too expensive to afford? I'm moving toward the end of my presentation, redefining our roles. How do we teach journalism in our colleges and universities in a way that responds to these changes, technological changes that we see? How do we ensure survival of independent media? How do we reorganize our newsroom hierarchy and procedures to best meet the demands for fast and captivating news? How do we report the news in today's context? Are we going to continue teaching about 5 W's and 7 H, 5 W's and H? Inverted pyramid today? By the way, who would dare to invert a pyramid? Just think about that pyramid in Egypt. How long should it take for us to gather, process, send, edit news, and make editorial decisions, and then share it with the rest of the world? While there are some people who send it instantly without any process. How do we make news more interesting? Since credibility and reliability are still lacking in many digital platforms, how do we make that our niche? How do we change formats of broadcast material into a variety of interesting short packages that may capture the attention of our audiences? What about storytelling, for example? How long can a newspaper as we know it today survive? A newspaper, by the way. We had here on the first day of presentation that in the last 5 years, newspapers globally have lost half their revenues. How long can popular music played on radio every day continue to attract young people? Because today they access music elsewhere using their gadgets at their convenient time. How long can television, as we have known it, continue to mesmerize audiences the way it did in the 30s and later years? And with the fourth industrial revolution, with artificial intelligence, how prepared are we to transform? If you read Acemoglu and Robinson, read Professor Noah Harari, he has written several books, Homo sapiens, Homo Deus, Challenges of the 21st Century. Read Schwab, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, and several others. We will see that if we are not prepared, we are likely to, somebody comes in with a bag full of content saying, we will give, if you buy these, we will give you these free. And I go through the content that somebody wants to sell me. It has no relevance to my own environment. And I say, I'm sorry. I can't feed Tanzanians with foreign content, even if it were free. How do we as media make our own culture, cultural stories and narratives relevant and sexier in the context of an avalanche of foreign ones flowing onto Africa? How do we change the negative perceptions of Africa? My sister, on the first day, she talked about that, my sister from AU. How do we change perceptions of Africans and Africa perpetuated and fed on us for centuries? How do we ensure that we are relevant to our own communities? I'm finishing now, but let me give you the hard lessons. This is World Press Freedom Day, and I'm free to express my views, isn't that so? Do we still believe that only governments must be watched? That we as media, we are the watchdog? Do we still believe that only the governments must be watched? How about foreign powers, corporate powers, that are often more restrictive to media freedoms than even government? I wish I had time, I would have explained that more. Are we making any critical interrogation of foreign paradigms that have rendered our own intelligence irrelevant and obnoxious to a point of absurdity? How do we turn certain intercourses between Africa and some developed nations from some form of chronic infidelity into a more meaningful, respectful, mutually beneficial engagement of equals? And how do we regulate media in general and digital platforms in particular, to enhance professionalism? How do we ensure protection of women and children who face the digital onslaught? There is a story going around. If you think this is just a cliche, there's a story going around about a girl 10 years old from Nigeria. She was a TikToker. She's famous. I think she has about 2 million followers. And she's in these, these modern schools in Africa, something international. So they went on an excursion in Dubai, and then she was raped, 10 years old. So you can imagine, and the boys, other school boys were there, they recorded the event, and then they started circulating the incident on the internet. You can imagine that a 10-year-old girl who is a victim, how do we deal with such issues? Furthermore, how do we develop new ideas to help our traditional media survive financially, at least for some time? Lastly, today is World Freedom Day, and to borrow wisdom philosopher Isaiah Berlin, I ask you, what aspect of freedom are we here to discuss or demand? Freedom from somebody, or freedom to do something? And with that, I leave you with a few takeaway points. Now, I talked about, at the beginning, my presentation was supposed to also state our critical role as media today. As you have noted, I've put more questions than answers, but let me just share with you a few. These are things I've learned myself. I've been in the field as a journalist, and I've been at the university teaching and doing research, and now I'm actually in the field again, administering a media organization. We as media must accept that we need to be intellectually inclined. And I'm not saying we should all be intellectuals. I'm simply saying, let's be intellectually inclined. Question things. We have to be ideologically aware. Somebody says, no, ideologies were defeated and now we have a unipolar world. It's not true. We have to be ideologically aware. We have to be patriotic. We have to be culturally rooted. We should not ignore our own culture. We will get nowhere if we do so. We have to be professionally equipped, and by that I mean a lot of things. We have to be technologically ready, and lastly, we have to be financially savvy, creative, business-minded. Otherwise, we will be taken out of business, as happened during the dinosaurs and Nokia. Thank you very much.